Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to unpack a really transformative and honestly often surprising period in Japanese history. We're talking about the post-World War II student movement, specifically from, say, the mid-1940s right through into the early 1970s.
Right. And we've pulled together a range of materials for this. Some Wikipedia overviews for the basics, but also some pretty detailed academic journal articles.
Yeah, quite a mix.
And our goal here really is to pull out the most crucial insights from all this stuff so you, the listener, can grasp the origins, how it all evolved, the key moments, those internal conflicts that really broke it apart eventually.
Right.
And also it's kind of surprising links to movements elsewhere during the Cold War. We want to cover it thoroughly, but, without getting totally bogged down in every little detail.
Absolutely. We know you want that deep understanding of complex topics, but in a way that, well, respects your time and keeps things engaging. So, Okay, let's dive in. The end of World War II. Huge impact on Japan, especially the youth. What was that like? What were they feeling right after the surrender?
Well, the immediate aftermath. It was incredibly complex for young people. There was definitely relief. The war's finally over.
Sure.
But alongside that, often a really profound sense of guilt. Many had survived when so many others, classmates, friends, brothers, hadn't.
Wow, yeah, survivor's guilt.
Exactly. And the sheer trauma of the war itself, the fire bombings, the hardship, it forged this powerful, widespread commitment to pacifism in that generation. They were absolutely determined that Japan should never, ever repeat what they saw as the catastrophe of the war years. This deep desire for peace, it really became a key driver for a lot of the student activism later on.
That makes total sense. And then into this charged atmosphere comes the U.S.-led Allied occupation. You mentioned it had a kind of double-edged influence.
Precisely. Yeah, its impact was definitely twofold. In the beginning, the occupation was all about demilitarization and democratization.
Okay.
So they released left-wing political prisoners, communists, socialists, people suppressed during the war. Their parties were legalized. The occupation actually encouraged labor unions and student groups as part of this democratic push.
Really? They encouraged them?
Initially, yes. And they pushed hard for democratic reforms in education, heavily based on American ideas. So that first phase, kind of unintentionally, provided both the ideas and some of the organizing tools for a student movement to grow.
Okay, so it created the space, the ideas.
Yeah.
But then you mentioned this reverse course. What happened there?
Right. So starting around 1947, maybe a bit earlier, the Cold War starts heating up. And occupation policy does this major U-turn, the reverse course. The main goal shifts to containing communism. So that meant pushing for Japan's rearmament as a buffer against the Soviets, stabilizing the economy to make communism less appealing, and actively cracking down on suspected communist influence. That was the Red Purge.
Right.
They started strengthening the conservative anti-communist forces in Japan. So, you see, the early reforms empowered the left, but the reverse course gave them a clear target to oppose the suppression, the conservative resurgence, that tension, a major engine for the movement.
And it wasn't just politics changing, right? The whole education system got turned upside down.
Totally. Imagine you're taught ultranationalism, emperor worship, Japan's divine mission your whole life, and then boom, suddenly it's all American-style democracy. It was a massive shock. And it caused a lot of anger, a lot of bitterness towards the older generation.
I can imagine feeling betrayed.
Exactly. Betrayed by the people who, in their eyes, led the country into disaster and sacrificed so many young lives. That anti-war feeling, rooted in their own experiences and this educational whiplash, it stayed a really powerful undercurrent, even when the movement later split into factions.
And within that educational shakeup, you said leftist thought made a comeback, partly driven by teacher guilt.
Yeah, it's interesting. When communists were released, some having been jailed for years, it opened up space for those ideas again. And you had many teachers, professors feeling deeply guilty about supporting the war effort, about teaching that ultra-nationalist stuff to kids who then died.
Right.
So under the occupation, embracing Marxism became, for some, a way to kind of atone. It influenced their teaching, their research. And the Japan Communist Party, the JCP, was pretty quick to capitalize on that climate, gaining a lot of influence in education circles, even if not in general elections. Right. Another key piece of the foundation.
This influence in education sounds critical. It led straight to Nikyuso, the teachers' union.
That's right. By June 47, the JCP was instrumental in setting up Nikyuso. It quickly represented most teachers and professors nationwide.
Wow, most.
Yeah, huge reach. Initially JCP influenced, later more aligned with the Socialist Sushi Labor Federation. Nikiso took a very active, often militant stance against the conservative governments. They were really vocal, pushing leftist and pacifist ideals, and that undoubtedly shaped the thinking of the students they taught. The government tried to weaken them later, but early on, Nikiso was a powerful force shaping that generation's worldview.
So with all this political and educational change swirling around, what were the students themselves actually doing initially? What were their first goals?
Well, right after the war, a big focus was getting back university autonomy and academic freedom. Japanese universities were historically based on the German Humboldtian model.
Humboldtian, meaning?
Being the university should be independent from direct political meddling, even if state-funded. And it saw students and faculty as kind of co-equals in seeking knowledge, students having a real say. But during the 1930s, with militarism rising, the government had really attacked that autonomy.
Like with suppressing scholars. Minobi, Yanehara, Suda, those cases.
Exactly, those cases. Really chilling examples of academic freedom being crushed. So, post-war, students were determined to reclaim that independence. The very first big student strike was actually at Mito High School, September 45.
High school.
Yeah. Protesting an authoritarian president appointed by the government who'd punished liberal teachers and taken away student self-governance in the dorms.
Did it work?
It did. They occupied a dorm for 37 days successfully. The president was dismissed. It was a huge early win, set a real precedent, showed collective action could work.
That must have lit a fire. Did other schools follow?
Oh yeah. Similar protests started popping up at colleges and universities all over. Students demanded removal of pro-militarist faculty, bringing back social sciences, which had been banned as dangerous thoughts.
Right.
And crucially, student self-governance. University admins mostly gave in on the first 2 points pretty quickly, and eventually, under pressure, they yielded on self-governance too. It was the first real assertion of student power on campus.
And this led to the Jichikai, the self-governing associations.
Exactly. Tokyo University was first to formally allow them, January 47, the Jichikai.
Okay, Tokyo U.
Yeah. Now, initially, they didn't get a say in academic policy or uni administration itself, but they got significant control over student life, managing dorms, dining halls, student centers, clubs, activities. With today leading, other unis followed suit.
And everyone was automatically a member.
Yep, every registered student. Dues were even taken right out of tuition fees. These jichikai became the basic building blocks, the organizational units for the nationwide movement that was coming. They provided structure and funding too.
And the JCP saw an opportunity here, right, to link these campus groups together. What spurred that on?
Definitely. The JCP saw the potential power. They strategically used their organizing skills to try and weld these separate jichikai into a national force.
What gave them the opening?
Well, students were furious when the occupation authorities suddenly canceled a planned general strike in February 47, and then the government proposed massive tuition hikes at public universities, deeply unpopular. So students felt they needed a stronger, coordinated voice to fight these national issues. The JCP stepped right in, offered help, built networks, pushed the idea of a united front.
Which brings us to Zengakuren, September 1948. And it sounds like the JCP gained influence very quickly there. How?
Yes, Zengakuren, the All-Japan Federation of Student Self-Government Associations, formed September 48, quickly grew to include almost all campus jichikai. And yes, it fell under strong JCP influence very fast.
Why so fast?
Well, Zengakuren's first chairman, Takai Teruo, a Todai student and JCP member himself, he argued that the occupation's heavy-handed university reforms, plus the Japanese government's clumsy way of implementing them, were the main unifying factors.
External pressure.
Right. These perceived injustices push students together, Take argued, into this national federation as resistance. And the JCP, already organized with experienced people and a clear agenda, was perfectly placed to provide the structure and direction for this new national body. They pretty quickly dominated the leadership.
Okay, so we've got the movement born from post-war conditions, occupation policies, leftist ideas, focused initially on universities, then united nationally under Zengakuren, largely guided by the JCP. But you said that unity fractured. The reverse course played a big role.
It absolutely did. As the reverse course intensified, driven by the Cold War, the Soviet A-bomb, communist victory in China, the Korean War.
Right, big global shifts.
The occupation's focus flipped totally from democracy promotion to hardcore anti-communism in Japan. This led straight to the Red Purge, systematically removing thousands of suspected communists from jobs, including in education.
Wow.
This crackdown on the left created huge internal tensions and definitely contributed to the fracturing of that initial unity.
So the very ideology inspiring many students was now being suppressed. That must have caused serious friction, forced people to rethink things.
It certainly did. But the break with the JCP wasn't just because of the Red Purge pressure. Inside Zengakuren, disillusionment with the JCP's own policies was growing.
How so?
Well, in the early 50s, apparently under pressure from Stalin, the JCP briefly pushed for immediate violent revolution in Japan. They even told students to form mountain village guerrilla squads.
Seriously, guerrilla squads?
Yeah. It was a radical, unrealistic policy, total failure, led to arrests, alienated the public. Then, by 1955, the JCP abruptly reversed course, even blaming the students for the earlier violence.
Ouch.
Exactly. That U-turn angered and disillusioned many activists. They started questioning their loyalty to the party, looking for other leftist ideas.
That sounds like a crucial turning point. Where did they look if not the JCP?
Well, feeling betrayed by the JCP's flip-flopping and, perceived opportunism, many started digging into the original writings, Marx, Lenin, and especially Trotsky.
Going back to the sources.
Right. And this intellectual exploration led to new leftist currents, new groups forming. Key ones were the Japan Trotskyist League, also called the Revolutionary Communist League, or Kikuchis, and the Communist League, known as the Bund, or Bunto.
And what was their core message?
Their main thing was anti-imperialism and anti-Stalinism. Critical of both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, saw both as imperialist in their own ways and strongly opposed to the JCP's Stalinist brand of communism, which they saw as bureaucratic authoritarian. It offered a more radical, independent path for disillusioned students.
And these new groups quickly gained ground within Zengakuren, eventually taking control. How'd they manage that?
They did. By 1959, these new groups, especially the Bund and Kakuchido, managed to seize control of Zengakuren's central committee. Reports say they used cutthroat electioneering tactics.
No.
Basically outmaneuvered the remaining JCP loyalists. It was a major shift. Zengakuren moved away from the JCP's line towards this more radical, anti-Stalinist, anti-imperialist stance. This really changed the game for what came next, especially the huge 1960 ANPO protests.
Right, the 1960 ANPO protests against revising the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. That sounds like this massive, unified moment, but you're saying the cracks were already showing.
It was a massive outpouring, yeah. Huge opposition. Even though the revised treaty had some improvements for Japan, the whole left, students included, wanted the treaty gone entirely.
Okay.
So they formed the Kokumin Kaigi, the People's Council, to prevent revision, bringing together unions, parties, civic groups, and Zengakuren, now led by these new leftist factions.
The Bund Kakukichtu.
Right. They were a crucial, very visible part of this coalition, basically on its board of directors. At its peak during ANPO, Zengakuren could get over 300,000 students out on the streets from 120-plus campuses. Immense power.
Huge numbers.
But yeah, even then, with everyone united against the treaty, serious tactical and ideological splits were already opening up within Zengakuren about how best to protest.
Okay, so even in that big moment, fault lines, what were the main differences between these factions inside Zengakuren?
Yeah, a big split was forming. You had the mainstream faction, mostly the Trotskyist-leaning Bund and Kakuku-dude folks. They saw Japanese monopoly capital as the main enemy.
Okay, focus on domestic powers.
Right. So their strategy was big demos at the Diet, the PM's residence confronting the Japanese government directly. They also favored more confrontational tactics, inspired by earlier successful protests like at the Sunagawa base. They thought disruption would win public sympathy.
And the other side?
The anti-mainstream. Still a lot of campus groups closer to the JCP line. For them, the main enemy was American imperialism.
So focus on the U.S.
Exactly. They wanted protests at the U.S. Embassy, and they pushed for peaceful, disciplined demos. They often publicly slammed the mainstream guys as Trotskyist provocateurs whose tactics would backfire and alienate people. So fundamental disagreements on the enemy, the tactics, creating more and more friction.
And despite all that mobilization, the protests failed. The treaty revision happened in June 1960. What did that failure do to the student movement?
Huge blow. Widespread disillusionment, demoralization across the whole left, definitely including Zengakuren. Putting in all that energy, getting so much public support, and then failure. It hit hard.
Yeah.
Inside Zengakuren, the immediate aftermath was just bitter finger-pointing. Who screwed up? Whose fault was it? These arguments just blew up the existing divisions.
So it wasn't just disappointment, it was tearing itself apart.
Pretty much. It marked the end of that relatively unified Anpo struggle movement and kicked off Zengakuren's rapid fragmentation into loads of smaller, often really hostile factions. Failing to stop Anpo was a major turning point, leading straight into intense infighting and a big decline in influence.
So Anpo's failure didn't just end the unity, it actively drove the fragmentation. Leading into the 60s, this season of schisms sounds incredibly messy.
Exceptionally messy, yeah. Anpo was the catalyst. Those ideological and tactical fights just exploded afterwards. Zengakuren disintegrated fast into countless smaller, often violently opposed sects. Sakudo.
And younger activists were breaking away.
Yeah, a younger generation got really critical of what they saw as the hierarchy and rigidity of the old left, meaning the JCP mainly. They wanted to break free, find new, more radical ways. This rejection of the established left, the search for new revolutionary paths, it just fueled the explosion of competing factions.
And this season of schisms brought the Uchigiba internal violence between sects. That sounds horrific.
It was horrific, often called Bunretsu no Kisetsu, Season of Schisms, characterized by intense, sometimes deadly internal violence Uchigeba.
Meaning?
Literally internal violence or inner warfare. Student radicals, identified by helmet colors, armed with wooden staves zigababu, violence sticks, fought brutal battles, not just with police, but maybe even more viciously, with rival student factions.
Wow.
People talk about 5 main sects, but honestly, it was a constantly shifting mess of factions and sub-factions, each with its own ideology, often driven by personal hatreds, too. This internal violence became this tragic hallmark of the mid to late 60s student movement, really damaged its image.
Amidst all that chaos and violence, were there any efforts to build broader movements around specific issues? Like Baharan and Zenkichat, were they a reaction against the infighting?
Exactly. By the mid-60s, many on the left students, intellectuals were really energized by opposition to Japan's support for the U.S. war in Vietnam.
Right.
But they were also totally put off, disillusioned by the endless ideological fights and the brutal uchigeba of the new left sects. So, yeah, there was a push for new kinds of movements, less rigid, less hierarchical, open to more people regardless of affiliation.
And Baharan fit that bill.
Perfectly. Baharan, the Citizens League for Peace in Vietnam, founded in '65 by prominent intellectuals. It created exactly that space. Ordinary citizens could protest Vietnam without getting tangled in the sect's doctrinal, often violent disputes.
And Zenkichi was similar, but focused more on campus issues.
Yes, exactly. Starting in '67, inspired by earlier activists like Michiko Kamba, students formed Zenkichi all-campus joint struggle committees.
Joint struggle.
The idea was explicit, open to any student, any faculty member concerned about university issues, admin policies, tuition hikes, Vietnam involvement, whatever their personal politics or sect affiliation. A broad coalition for joint struggle on concrete problems, trying to get past the sectarian paralysis.
Okay, so that sets the stage for those huge university protests in '68, '69, the Daigaku Funsu or Daigaku Desu. Sounds like they brought the movement back to national attention, big time.
They absolutely did. Nationwide protests shut down dozens of universities. It was definitely part of that global '68 wave of student protest and unrest. And often, activists from the different new left Zengakuren sects actually found common ground with Zenki Tour organizers in these campus struggles, so that there was some collaboration.
Quite active.
Pretty radical. Barricading campuses, occupying buildings, stopping class and exams, sometimes even harassing or detaining university administrators and professors. And the demands were all over the place. Specific campus gripes, sure, but also calls to overthrow the whole system and the Vietnam War. It was a major escalation, a huge challenge to the universities and the government.
Those tactics sound intense. And the Shinjuku riot in October '68 that really stands out, right, shows the scale of confrontation.
Absolutely. Shinjuku riot was dramatic. Tens of thousands of activists, lots of students, occupied Shinjuku Station, massive Tokyo transport hub. Why? To protest jet fuel transport for U.S. bases for Vietnam.
And the police response.
Swift and very violent. They even invoked the Anti-Subversive Activities Act, a controversial law aimed at extremists. Lots of arrests, injuries on both sides, a stark example of the escalating conflict.
Just how widespread were these campus protests in '68, '69?
Astonishingly widespread. Significant protests on 165 university campuses. About 70 campuses faced long-term barricades and occupations. Even many high schools saw protests. The unrest was really pervasive.
And intellectually, what was driving this intensity in '68, '69? Who were they reading, thinking about?
It was a real mix. Classical Marxists, sure, Marx, Trotsky providing critiques of capitalism, imperialism.
Okay.
French existentialists were big too, Sartre, Camus. Their ideas about individual responsibility, freedom, rebellion against the system really resonated. And within Japan, the philosopher Takaaki Yoshimoto was super important. His critiques of concepts like autonomy, Jiritsusei, and subjectivity, Shutaye, pushed many activists towards ideas like self-negation, Jikohite, and rigorous self-criticism, Hansei, as paths to revolutionary consciousness.
Self-negation, self-criticism.
Yeah, this intense inward focus, this drive for ideological purity. But sometimes that actually made it harder for them to build broad, lasting coalitions for action.
It sounds like such a volatile mix: idealism, frustration, intense ideology. But it seems public opinion eventually swung pretty hard against the students. Why?
You're right, it did. As the campus violence escalated, the long closures, canceled entrance exams, disruption to ordinary life, public sympathy just evaporated. Eventually turned quite negative.
Understandable, maybe?
Yeah. The constant clashes with police, the uchigaba between factions, the perceived arrogance, the impracticality of some radical demands. It alienated people who might have initially supported their concerns about Vietnam or university reform. The disruption to education, especially for kids trying to get into uni, caused real resentment, and the media often focused on the violence and chaos, too.
And that shift in public mood allowed the government to act more forcefully, leading to that University Management Act in '69.
Exactly. That act, passed after all the disruption, gave police a clear legal basis to go onto campuses, break barricades, restore order. Essentially, it gave authorities much stronger powers to shut down the protests. Its passage and enforcement in '69 was a major turning point, a huge blow to the New Left movement. Really marked the beginning of the end for those large-scale campus struggles.
So the late '60s intensity faded. The '70s seemed like a clear decline. What kept driving things downward?
Well, those twin defeats the campus struggles ending in '69, the big Anapo protests failing again in '70. They led to yet another round of bitter infighting and even more extreme splits among the remaining radicals.
Or schisms?
Yeah. And tragically, the uchijaba, the internal violence, it actually continued for decades, killing numerous activists.
Decades? That's shocking.
It is. As moderate activists drifted away, control fell to smaller, increasingly radicalized groups. And some, seeing no other path, resorted to terrorism as, revolutionary struggle.
Like the Japanese Red Army.
Exactly. The 1972 Lod Airport massacre is a chilling example. Okamoto Kuchu, one participant, saw it as his duty as a soldier of the revolution, and his father apparently said participation in the student movement was normal. Just shows how deep that radical ideology went for some. These violent acts just completely alienated the public, destroyed any remaining legitimacy.
A truly tragic descent. But despite this internal collapse and extremism, the movement in its earlier days did influence others globally. It was seen as a model.
It's true, yeah. By the late 60s, Zengakuren's organized, confrontational style fascinated and even inspired new left movements elsewhere. France, Germany, South Korea, Mexico, the US.
Really? Even in the US?
Oh, yeah. Zengakuren leaders actively built international links. Figures from the American New Left, Carl Oglesby from SDS, people from SNCC, they took notice. Oglesby visited Japan. Zengakuren got positive mentions in SDS publications like New Left Notes. The scale, the intensity of Japanese protests looked like a model of radical student action to some.
And it wasn't just one-way influence. Japanese activists were looking outward too, especially towards Asia.
Definitely. Groups like Bahrain worked hard on international solidarity, especially around Vietnam. They hosted big conferences, like the U.S.-Japan Two Nations Conference for Peace in Vietnam in '66 and '68.
What was the goal there?
A key aim was letting Western anti-war activists hear directly from Asian voices about the war, about imperialism in the region. A conscious effort to learn from Asian experiences, recognizing Japan's own complex history, victim and victimizer in Asia.
Finally, we have to touch on the Kawaguchi Daisabrus incident in 1972. That sounds particularly grim, a real symbol of the internal violence.
It was horrific and deeply symbolic, yes. Kawaguchi Daisabru, a Waseda University student. He was abducted, tortured, murdered by members of the revolutionary Marxist faction Kakumaru-ha.
Why?
They mistakenly thought he was a sympathizer of a rival sect, the core faction Shukaku-ha. The details of the lynching were gruesome, shocked the public.
I bet.
Huge outrage, not just at Kakamaruha's barbarity, but also aimed at Waseda University authorities. Some felt the uni had been too lenient, maybe even colluded with the radicals on campus. The Kawaguchi incident just further delegitimized the whole movement in the public, starkly highlighted the tragic results of that escalating, often senseless internal violence, a brutal illustration of the descent into extremism. Its impact was so deep it even shows up in Japanese literature and film, like Murakami's Kafka on the Shore. A really dark mark on the cultural memory.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we followed this incredibly dramatic, complex path. From post-war idealism, fighting for university autonomy, through the massive Ampo protests, then the fragmentation, the intense, ultimately self-destructive campus battles of the late 60s.
Right.
And that tragic decline into infighting, violence, extremism in the 70s. It's just worlds away from where it started.
Yeah, the aha moment for me, I think, is that stark contrast. The early hopes for a democratic, peaceful future versus the reality of bitter internal war and violence. It's surprising and, frankly, sobering.
Definitely.
But it's also fascinating how this movement, even as it collapsed internally in Japan, became this source of inspiration and maybe a warning for new left movements globally during that really turbulent time.
And we really hope that for you listening, this deep dive has given you a solid, but still manageable understanding of all those complex forces, post-war conditions, shifting ideas, internal fights that shaped this crucial period in Japanese history. Hopefully without making your head spin too much.
So thinking about that arc from idealism to violence, it does raise some big questions, doesn't it? What does this story tell us about the challenges, the potential dangers baked into radical social movements generally? And what about that constant tension between fighting for a collective goal and the way deeply held individual ideologies can just tear things apart? You look back and you can't help but wonder, could things have gone differently? What points were critical? And what lessons are there in this very intense history for understanding social movements even today? It's complex, for sure. Lots to think about.